Well, good morning, everyone. We'll, I'm sure, be having some more people join in as we hit the top of the hour just now. So again, welcome. As you join, you can introduce yourself in the chat, and it's great to see everybody here already. It's a very good turnout. So we'll get started now. I do have the recording on. We'll be recording this meeting and making the recording available online for later. So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you who have joined today. And thank you for logging in for this roundtable discussion. I will put my video on now. There we go. So welcome everybody. My name is Laura Cramer, and I lead the work on policies and institutions within the project known as Accelerating Impacts of CGIAR Climate Research for Africa, with the acronym AICCRA or AICCRA. So what we have scheduled today is a policy roundtable, and it will be presenting a policy coherence study that was conducted by Romy Chevallier. And this policy coherence study is part of our work plan within the AICCRA project. AICCRA is a 3-year project aimed at scaling out climate smart agriculture technologies and practices and climate information services to farmers and other value chain actors in 6 focus countries, and making these technologies, practices, and services available to farmers in other African countries as well. Those we refer to as spillover countries, and we're working to link up with other processes in those spillover countries. So I know that we're all aware about the need to respond to climate change. It's growing more urgent by the day. We need actions in all sectors and at all levels. So governments, corporations, individuals, we all have roles to play, and governments help to guide these actions with their policies, strategies, and plans. So what we've done is we've carried out this policy coherence analysis on Africa-wide climate, agricultural, environmental, gender, and social inclusion policies and strategies as a way to identify gaps, overlaps, and alignment of all of those policies. And this has drawn on input from across CGIAR and has incorporated lessons and activities from the work, the AICCRA work in the West Africa region that we are doing, and in the Eastern and Southern Africa region under AICCRA, and other relevant initiatives as well. And so the aim is to better understand the extent to which identified policies and strategies integrate agricultural adaptation and mitigation actions, and the coherence of these across the different levels. So what we'll have first is Romy, our consultant who carried out this work. She'll present the findings of the report, and thanks. Yeah, just try to keep everyone muted so that we don't get background noise. So Romy has been working with us since last year, and she really has done an excellent job on this study. She did really in-depth interviews with a lot of key informants, some of whom we'll hear from today on the panel. And it's been quite a lot of work that has gone into this. So I know she's really excited to finally present this to all of you, to get feedback and to release the report. So Romy is based in South Africa. She had been working with a South Africa policy think tank before coming and working with AICCRA, and we're really glad that she's with us now. I will also just now introduce our roundtable panelists so that we don't have to do that later. So after Romy presents the report, we'll have responses from 4 different people. The first will be Kwame Ababio, and he is a climate change, environment policy, and governance specialist with wide-ranging experience at different levels, including leading the implementation of many development initiatives in Africa, especially on climate change within the African Union system. He's a senior program officer of the African Union Development Agency, AUDA-NEPAD, and he oversees advisory services and is responsible for the agency's environmental governance and climate change initiatives. Kwame coordinates AUDA-NEPAD's support to African countries in the implementation of the nationally determined contributions and has represented the agency in many international fora. So welcome, Kwame. We're excited to hear from you. We'll also have Ana Maria Loboguerrero. She's the Director for Climate Action at the Alliance of Bioversity International and International Center for Tropical Agriculture, which is known as the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT. She also leads the AICCRA program, and this has funded the policy coherence work. Prior to this, she was the head of global policy research for the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, CCAFs. After Ana Maria, we'll have George Wamukoya, who has over 30 years of experience in formulation of international, regional, and national policies. He's the team leader of the Africa Group of Negotiators Expert Support, known as AGNES, and also serves as director of the AGNES Climate Leadership Program. He's a lead negotiator on agriculture within the UNFCCC. And prior to establishing AGNES, George assisted in forming the climate change unit within COMESA, where he worked as the climate advisor for more than 6 years. And finally, we'll have Caroline Mwongera as a respondent. She is a senior scientist and global leader of policies and institutions for climate action at the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT. She brings a multidisciplinary perspective to the challenges of agriculture and climate change and focuses on bridging the gap between science and policy by mainstreaming adaptation concerns into development policies, planning, and decision-making. And she has expertise in climate smart agriculture, climate smart investments, climate risk assessments, farming systems, trade-off analyses, and many more. So I welcome all of our panelists. We look forward to hearing from you. But first, we'll hear from Romy Chevallier with her presentation. So please join me in welcoming Romy. Go ahead.
Thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction. I'm just going to quickly get my screen share going. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. Laura, can you see my screen share?
Yes, we are seeing. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Laura, for the kind introduction, and welcome colleagues from across Africa, as I can see. So it's fantastic that you are able to join today. And thank you very much to the colleagues on the panel that have agreed to make some comments on this paper. As Laura said, it's been a couple of months of hard work. So I'm glad I'm able to disseminate and share some of the working paper findings with you. As Laura mentioned, I'm Romy. I have a background in climate change policy and have worked in the think tank for many years, but I'm now happy to be part of the AICCRA Theme 1 team. So as we know, climate smart agriculture policy coherence occurs when actions across policies, sectors, and stakeholders are actively aligned towards meeting their agreed objectives. Colleagues, if I can just ask you to keep your microphones on mute if possible. Thank you so much. And most of us obviously working in the field will understand the importance of climate smart agricultural policy coherence. So just to reiterate, obviously coherence between policies, frameworks, and programs dealing with climate change, agricultural development, food security, environment, social cohesion are prerequisites for the adoption and the transformation of climate smart agriculture across Africa. It's also a requirement for coherent financing of CSA across the continent. Obviously, if we can achieve better policy coherence, we are able to trigger the desired transformation of resilient agricultural production and food systems that are needed to support Africa's development objectives. The report, which I hope you've all received, and if not, obviously will be available to you, is there is a couple of objectives. The first one was just for me to have a look at what was happening across the continent, to assess Africa-wide efforts that support coherence of climate change, agriculture, and food security policies at multiple scales. So both everything from the continental to the local level. I did an assessment of the institutional and stakeholder environment that informs and influences CSA policy development in Africa. I tried to, where possible, identify policy gaps and entry points to inform future funding interventions related to CSA activities. And what I did this through using case study examples and best practice examples from the continent to showcase where policy coherence had made headway. And what I've done is I've provided policy recommendations, mainly to the policy community, but also to obviously development partners and other partners to help support efforts towards coherent policy. CSA has been used broadly, that this kind of the definition has been used broadly in the study to include climate adaptation and mitigation actions in agriculture, or actions that promote resilience in agricultural sectors. So just to quickly reiterate, adaptation obviously is where we look to reduce the climate impacts on the agricultural system. Mitigation are obviously the actions that we put in place to reduce carbon dioxide and sequester carbon. So all of these obviously to promote resilience in the agricultural sector. So the CSA definition has been used slightly broadly in the study. What I've done in terms of the methodology of putting this together is I conducted a qualitative desktop research review, essentially looking at a variety of policies, strategies, programs at multiple scales. I then contacted 13 individuals that I did a targeted stakeholder survey with, and I followed up with interviews. And it's actually really nice because I see some of the people participating today were those stakeholders. For the purposes of the study, I've kept them under Chatham House rules, i.e. I've attributed what they've had to say, but I haven't attributed to the individual. So I haven't said necessarily that this particular person has said anything specific, but I've just used the ideas and the concepts to inform my research. And then here we are today at the policy roundtable. And I just want to reiterate that this is a working paper and that any information, comments, feedback that I get today will be incorporated into the final report. And the idea is that I actually produce a shorter, coherent policy briefing for hopefully uptake at the policy level. As I mentioned, I did this analysis at multiple scales. So when I did the analysis of policies and actions that existed, I looked at the global frameworks, at the continent-wide frameworks, at regional policies and national level. And obviously, I mean, this is an enormous task. So clearly, I've just kind of brushed through them and looked at the main policy documents that inform CSA policy on our continent. Obviously, this is mainly within the kind of climate change and agricultural and food security spaces. And then I've also included some of the development frameworks under, for example, Agenda 2030 and the SDG frameworks, the UN Decade for Restoration, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see them listed here. Obviously, the most important at the global level are your UNFCCC discussions on climate change and the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the Food System Summit, and obviously dialogues that are coming from there, the UN Decade for Restoration, etc. At the continent-wide level, and these are obviously documents that many of you will be dealing with and working with, probably in a much more detailed manner than I've looked at them. So you might be able to share some comments today, but clearly, obviously, the Africa 2060 vision, which is the African Union's development vision for the continent, which includes aspects of agriculture and climate resilience. Obviously, you've got CAADP, which is the Comprehensive Africa Development Program, which is kind of one of the main policy documents, as well as obviously the Malabo Declaration to accelerate agricultural growth and transformation. And under these, we have various programs, commitments, etc., to actually try and enhance policy coherence and the CSA. And then more recently, and I'm not sure if all of you are aware, there's a climate change and resilient development strategy that the African Union has produced, and it was adopted in February this year. And under that climate change strategy, there is emphasis on climate smart agriculture and other aspects of agricultural transformation and food systems transformation. At the regional level, I did try and look at all regional economic communities, but some have more available information than others, and there are some economic communities that are making more headway than others. But generally looking at their regional policy, their agricultural policies, their agricultural investment plans, as well as their broader development plans for each of the regions. And then at the national level, obviously there's a lot of policy frameworks to consult, those related specifically to climate change. So for example, under the Paris Agreement, we know that we domesticate those agreements and in the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions for climate change, the long-term strategies, which many of our countries are currently formulating. We've got other climate change policies. We've got our agricultural plans and investment plans, our rural development and poverty plans, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a multitude of policy frameworks that exist. many of which are more progressive and inclusive than others, and some which have not made headway. So unfortunately, time doesn't allow me today to go into each of these, but hopefully you'll get the opportunity to have a look at my study, which does unpack each of these levels in a little bit more detail. What I decided to do today, because obviously there's a jam-packed agenda, is I wanted to provide you with a snapshot from the report. And what I decided to do was give you a kind of high-level overview of some of the recommended areas of action and support to enhance coherence at the policy level. So again, unfortunately, I'm not going to unpack the background and the kind of the analysis behind my findings. We can discuss that later if you like, but I just thought I'd give you the kind of the key recommendations and give you some snapshots into some of the case studies that I might have looked at. So key recommendations and action areas of support to promote coherent policies. The one, okay, so I've just obviously mentioned that there are these multiple scales, and we found that, well, I found that one of the key elements to reinforce policy cohesion is trying to reinforce the global to local policy engagement links. So obviously there's a lot happening at the international level, and translating a lot of these policy outcomes, visions, objectives, we find it very difficult to kind of looking at the trickle down to inform how local actors are meant to understand what's going on at the policy agenda, but also try and take those and support these initiatives at a more local, national or local level. So one of the recommendations is to support the high-level integration of global agendas by encouraging synergies and collaboration amongst multiple policy objectives and priorities that include CSM. How we can do this? We can create virtuous cycles of reinforcement between these global agreements of action and national level discussions. So essentially having national level discussions that mirror what is happening at the international level. It's important to obviously build agency and clear communication with local level actors to inform them about the outcomes of these processes so that their projects can be aligned and reinforced what is needed at the global level. And one of the very practical things we could do, for example, is I looked at some countries that had put representatives of different sectors and different stakeholder groupings on their national negotiating teams. So we see, for example, a movement towards the climate negotiations, agricultural actors being included in the national negotiating teams, which clearly brings in obviously different expertise, different interests into those forums. I give an example here, for example, where last year at the UN Food System Summit, this initiated dialogues at the national level. And essentially, these were tailored multi-stakeholder discussions around food systems reform at the country level. So by rolling out these dialogues, it allowed African countries from a diverse range of stakeholders to bridge what was happening at the global level and have conversations around how we could implement this at the national level, obviously still pertaining to the guiding frameworks of the UN Food System Summit. This is obviously, it's a difficult slide to explain, but essentially when I was thinking about giving recommendations, I thought one of the things that obviously is important to note is that there are a lot of existing frameworks and actors that are highly effective in this space. That need support. So essentially, it is not about rewriting new policy coherence documents. It's about looking at policy coherence indicators, frameworks, initiatives, and programs that exist, and looking at how we can support those. So these are some examples. I mean, these are very, very few examples, but the CADIP and its biannual review process, these obviously are important. Monitoring cohesion, dialogue at multiple levels perspective. And we need to support this process through leadership to drive government and stakeholder buy-in for the financing and implementation of the key recommendations that come out of these reviews. There's a common results framework for CSA that exists at a continental level. Again, one of the difficulties there is actually the input of productive and relevant information into that process. So where we can all support in terms of input data into the national reviews. Obviously within our own capacities, but in terms of recommendations of how to support these initiatives, these are some of them. The long-term strategies that I mentioned are being developed at the moment, the NDCs, which are currently being revised every 5 years, plus the national dialogues on food systems transformation. These are all important processes that need to be more inclusive. So they need to be supported through inclusive governance processes, shared learning, and adopting targets and indicators that include agricultural mitigation and adaptation interventions. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about inclusion in a moment. And then looking at a stakeholder or the current stakeholders, and there are numerous that are supporting processes at the different levels. But in terms of a continental stakeholder, that is the focal Institute for Policy Coordination, AUDA-NEPAD, and I'm so glad that we have Kwame here today to speak to us from that organization. Essentially, it needs to be supported. They play a vital function in CSA policy coherence, and obviously need to be supported through technical assistance, increased finance, institutional capacity, etc. What we need to think about in terms of kind of new or burgeoning policy processes is to ensure that CSA is mainstreamed into these new policy documents. So we see on the continent, obviously countries either having prepared or preparing their green economy strategies and their blue economy strategies. And we have to remember, obviously, the blue economy, just because of the fishery side of things, is included. As countries are formulating and developing and strengthening these policies, it's really important that we are cognizant of the fact that we need to include CSA and mainstream them into these policies. And this includes the post-COVID green recovery stimulus plans, which obviously look at how to promote climate resilience, food security on the continent. So we need to make sure that there's coherence in all sectors. The one thing is we need to make sure that the national agricultural investment programs we need to make sure that CSA programs are prominent and that there's a stronger emphasis on climate change and extreme weather events in those plans. And we need to make sure that CSA at the national level is mainstreamed all the way through investment and development plans at the sectoral, subnational, and national levels. And then obviously that CSA is included in M&E frameworks, and I'm going to speak to that later. So this is an example, of where Rwanda, in its current NDC, has mainstreamed climate smart agriculture. And what they've done, for example, is that they've developed targets and activities that are specific to climate smart agriculture within their NDC. So, for example, they've developed specific emission reduction targets for the agricultural sector with specific timeframes and finance. And they've also set a bunch of adaptation goals that specifically refer to agriculture. So this is a way that you can see that CSA is being mainstreamed into current policy. Obviously, what needs to take place is particularly at a national level is coordination, and coordination across obviously sectors, different levels of government, and this is essential for policy coordination. And I did a lot in my report. You will see there's a lot of emphasis at the national level on governance, institutional mechanisms, coordination mechanisms, etc. So very important from a cross-sectoral coordination and intergovernmental collaboration perspective. I've also said that national and regional level governance needs to ensure that oversight functions from a continental perspective. So we need to we always need to keep verifying that what we're doing, everybody's in check. And this is important that we institutionalize bodies for M&E functions, which we are doing, but some of these can be strengthened. And this is an example from South Africa, just to show the kind of comprehensive institutional setup that it has to promote coordination and communication across different levels of government. They've got a planning commission that assists in their low carbon resilient transition. They've got various intergovernmental and multi-sectoral bodies, and they've most recently set up a presidential commission that's going to look at moving them towards a just transition. But what's interesting is we can learn lessons from this in the climate smart agricultural space to ensure that what we do and the policies that we put in place are just and inclusive, etc. Obviously, mechanisms for dialogue and communication are essential. These are easy ways to promote coherence, integration, etc., across multiple stakeholders and multiple sectors. And we have already a lot of entities here are putting a lot of emphasis on multi-stakeholder platforms and conversations to share lessons, to learn, to make sure that various entities are in the group, are in the room and having conversations about their interests and needs. This is obviously most important from a vulnerable groupings perspective. We need to ensure that women, youth, gender are represented on these groupings, and that CSA alliances, which also exist at various levels, are integrated in these conversations. And there's a lot of emphasis at the moment on ensuring that the private sector is part of these conversations and that partnerships are developed to enhance coordination and communication. This is an example. I was reading a review of the 3rd biennial report under the Malibu Declaration. And essentially what's really important is that there are multi-stakeholder conversations that happen at the national level and at the regional level to unpack what the recommendations of these declarations say, and basically look at ways that national communications can support these continental frameworks. There's obviously a need to support the uptake of science and evidence into policy. So the whole policy, science to policy interface needs to be supported. And again, there are entities that are successfully doing this that I speak about in my report. But what is really important is obviously the co-production of data from multiple sources, including local knowledge sources. And the importance to improve and support the capacity of scientific, technical, and coordination organizations that are playing at the interface of CSA policy. Inclusive governance it came up in my interviews. It's probably one of this and policy implementation were probably the 2 strongest features of the results from my survey. Inclusive governance, we know this, but it's whether we do this effectively or not is the problem. But essentially, it is vital to strengthen inclusive processes from the design phase of the policy process all the way through to implementation and execution. So the design stage will need to be specifically aligned with entities and specific interests and needs. And we see a lot of movement at the moment with farmers' organizations and other entities engaging in these processes. What is important from the policy side is that there are entry points for engagement, and that policy actors across the board understand what type of entry points they have to influence and inform policy. And this is also with relevance to local actors in policy implementation and in monitoring and evaluation. And it's obviously very important that stakeholders, again, vulnerable stakeholders, are represented. And how we can do this is actually by including them in specific indicators and targets within policies. So, for example, I've been looking quite a lot at the NDC, the nationally determined contributions that each country's commitment under the Paris Agreement. These NDC goal policy frameworks are revised every 5 years, which automatically opens up an opportunity for local actors to proactively engage in the policy review process, to make sure that their needs and their interests are sufficiently integrated and reflected in these documents. Obviously, the onus does not only lie on the local actors, but also on the government to open up spaces for engagement. But it's a little bit of a tension between making sure that that local partners are engaged in the various platforms, and that government has opened up space for them to engage. And as I mentioned, we can do this through specific quantifiable targets and indicators that include vulnerable groupings. So, for example, and I give many examples in my report, but Zambia has integrated gender targets within its NDC implementation plan and M&E framework. The promotion of leadership and political will is a very important one. There are local, I actually identify them in the report, some local actors, focal points, champions for CSA policy coherence. It's very important that these entities are supported and equipped with the necessary platforms for advocacy. And it's obviously important, the political leadership and commitment by countries, high-level representatives, they have necessary capacity to drive government and a stakeholder buy-in for financing and implementation of coherent CSA policies. There's a strengthening of capacity, which is obviously very important from a policy coherence perspective. Local organizations, there is a space for engagement to assist them with understanding the policy cycles, understanding where the intervention opportunities exist. So there is agency and capacity that can be built from local organizations' perspective. And then technical support that is obviously needed to support policymakers, understanding, for example, the global and regional processes around CSA, and there are forums and bodies to assist with capacity building. that exist. And the one here is AGNES. So obviously George is with us today and he'll speak more to this, but this is a very specific example of a capacity building initiative that trains African policymakers, advocates, researchers, etc., knowledge and capacity on climate governance, diplomacy, negotiation, leadership, etc. So there are numerous initiatives and these need to be supported. Monitoring and evaluation processes, I've already mentioned a couple of examples, but these also were clearly came out of my analysis, that indicators need to be specifically developed to assist with climate smart agriculture policy coherence. So indicators can be developed to increase alignment and implementation. And there are some policy documents that do include specific indicators, but they're few and far between. These accountability systems must also include a range of other players, not only government. There are a range of other players whose actions can also be accounted for in the M&E systems that we use. We can enhance the technical capacity of civil society to be more involved in M&E systems and reporting. And also obviously the need for technical and human capacity at the national government and regional communities level to support their ability to produce, compile quality country reports. And this is an example of ECOWAS. ECOWAS has actually been doing quite a lot of stuff around policy coherence, which I've mentioned in my report. They've developed, for example, a review and reporting procedure that includes and integrates cross-cutting themes into their review process beyond agricultural development. So they've included indicators around nutrition, resilience, sustainable and inclusive food systems. So these are very important that these indicators are specifically included. So the one, for example, is a reporting requirement from its member countries to report on their climate change commitments made under their NDCs, which is very innovative and different. ECOWAS has also developed this Global Alliance for Resilience, which aims to channel the efforts of different stakeholders towards a common results framework, and encourages each country to conduct an inclusive dialogue process to formulate its own national resilient priorities and indicators. Okay, and then the last one, before I finish off, is implementation. So I think this probably was the most prominent thing that came up, is that I think we're at the point now where there are a lot of policies and structures in place, but the implementation and the execution of these policies is falling short. So there's a lot of emphasis that's needed in terms of moving policy documents forward and adopting and popularizing them and ensuring their domestication. So I've made some suggestions here around enhancing popularization of frameworks at all levels, understanding the roles and responsibilities of various actors within these frameworks, and systems of domestication and implementation. So often we'll have a policy, but there's an absence of an implementation framework or indicators, roles and responsibilities, a resource mobilization plan, etc. So all these kind of documents need to support our policy frameworks to enhance coherence, and obviously the necessary financing capacity to support implementation. And this was an example of, just on the finance side, I was looking at some of the financial organizations and how they too can include CSA policy coherence in their funding criteria. They also play a role at screening projects for climate risks, as well as developing and using metrics and indicators to measure outcomes. For example, accounting for greenhouse gas emissions in projects and operations. And interestingly, we see that 52% of the World Bank's financing in agriculture also targets climate adaptation and mitigation. So essentially to say there's a role in policy coherence for everyone. From now on, as I mentioned today, I'll include the feedback from this event into my working paper. If there are any reviews or comments, I'll be so happy to receive them and to include them to my draft. And then to produce a policy briefing with key outcomes and recommendations. And I thank you for listening, and thank you for your time. And this is my email address, and I really would appreciate engagement. So if you would like to pick up any points of the paper, then please let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Romy, for that wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. So great. I think now we'll move on to our respondents. We'll go in the order from left to right that we have on the flyer. So I'll ask Kwame to come online first. I hope you're able to unmute yourself, Kwame. I had disabled unmuting for everybody, but it looks like you're ready to go. So Kwame, I think, we'll give you about 5 minutes to give us your response, your kind of reaction to Romy's report and presentation. And I was specifically thinking maybe you would be able to talk to us a little bit about how to better support, as Romy mentioned, countries giving inputs into that common results framework for CSA, if you have any comments about that. But overall, your general response as well. So welcome, Kwame.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thanks so much, Romy, for the presentation. I think you captured a lot of very, very important points, and your 13 recommendations are very apt to the kind of things we would want to see within the climate smart agriculture space. I would just want to pick up on a few of these recommendations that you have made. And one of them that you mentioned was investing in policy champions. Whilst this remains a very, very good initiative, I think over the period, the focus has really been looking at continental policy champions. I think we would have to evolve and really look at policy champions at national and local levels. In that, that is where implementation takes place, and we will need a lot more of these champions at the national and local places. Most of all, we will need to have policy champions who are actually farmers, who are practicing the trade and are implementing projects around climate smart agriculture. As we know, one of the sure bets to encourage uptake and involvement of a lot more farmers in climate smart agriculture is through peer-to-peer exchange learning. So I think that is one focus that we will need to improve upon, having more farmers who are practitioners to act as champions for CSA in Africa. Then also you reference the reinforcement of global to local policies. Obviously, this is a very, very important one. And looking at the plethora of global initiatives that we have. Last year, we had the Food Summit, and before that, many other interventions trying to improve food security, nutrition, and productivity around the world. I think one area that we can improve upon reinforcing global to local policies is to look at the nationally determined contributions within the context of the Paris Agreement. As you referenced, Rwanda, for instance, in its updated NDCs, has put in targets within the for CSA within its NDCs, and I think that is a very, very important inclusion, in which a number of African countries should be able to adopt. In the previous NDCs, we had about 23 countries that specifically target or mention climate smart agriculture. So clearly, this is an approach that a number of countries have adopted and see as one of the means for them to be able to meet their commitment. So it will be very, very important for a number of countries supported by regional and national institutions to have specific targets and that we can follow to be able to attain the goals that we have set for ourselves within the NDC. And then very, very importantly, another one you mentioned was around the monitoring and evaluation processes. Unfortunately, this has proven to be one of the major challenges within the CSA implementation architecture on the continent. As you will recall, in 2014, there was the 25 by 25 vision of having 25 million farming households practicing CSA by the year 2025. One of the stumbling blocks for us is that we do not have a close to exact figure showing the number of people who have adopted this approach. So sometimes it's difficult for us to really see how much progress we are making. So I think that is one area that a number of the institutions need to pull heads together and see how best we're able to monitor the uptake and progress of CSA implementation on the continent. And then because of time, I will just pick the last one, which has to do with financing. We all know financing still remains a major challenge for CSA adoption on the continent. I continuously reference this study that was done about 4 years ago by the International Institute of Environment and Development. And in that study, it's indicated that between 2003 and 2016, less than 10% of all funds earmarked for climate actions at the local, less than 10% of all funds earmarked for climate action actually reached local actors. So which tells us that there's a huge gap between where the funds are coming from, whether from public, private, or international sources, to local actors. And we need to build a kind of system that will enable local actors to be able to access resources in time and at scale. So in essence, I think this is a very well done report. And if we are able to help in building the capacity of institutions, particularly nationally, and it will help a great deal for in helping us to build the momentum around CSA on the continent. You reckon that 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of buzz around CSA, but we've seen a decline in that kind of buzz. And for us to bring it back on board, it will be very important that all the networks, the actors get back on track to ensure that we support farmers and also policymakers to bring CSA back onto the drawing board and onto the front burner of agricultural development on the continent in the face of climate change. So I think my 5 minutes will be up, so I'll hand over back to you, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwame. And I really like how you have emphasized the need for not only the need for policy champions, but policy champions at national and local levels coming from the farming community. I think that is really important. And this issue of financing, having the financing reaching local actors, I think those are all really key points. So thank you so much for your contributions. So next we'll have Ana Maria give her response to the report. And we look forward to hearing from you, Ana Maria. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much, Romy, for that presentation. That was really exciting to see that. So I'm just going to focus in 4 main points, and it's just reiterating a lot of the things that Romy already discussed, but I think that these 4 are really fundamental to move forward in relation to this agenda. The first point, it's the importance of giving the importance to moving from formulation to implementation in terms of these policies. And Africa, it's not the only continent that is suffering from this. Latin America, it's in a very similar situation in which we have seen tons of policies, strategies, plans in relation to how to implement climate smart agriculture. And that's really good, and that's good news because we are moving forward and the interest it's in there. But I think that we are really in a place to start thinking what's the best way to move from that stage of having all these policies, and the coherence of these policies, as was mentioned, it's very important, but really making sure that we are moving from this formulation phase into the implementation phase. And something that is very relevant in relation to moving from formulation to implementation, it's understanding the importance of contexts in terms of implementing these CSA technologies and practice, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to get into this implementation mode. So that's our first comment. Second comment, Romy presented tons of case studies where it's already happening in terms of the coherence, in terms of the implementation of these policies. And I'm just linking this to our AICCRA agenda. One of the main things that we want to accomplish through AICCRA is to get those lessons learned, successful cases that are happening in some African countries and bringing them to other countries in the continent. So this South-South collaboration in terms of lessons learned for these policy processes, just putting them together and connecting countries so that we can scale these success efforts. The third comment, it's in relation to capacity building. And capacity building is going to be fundamental to move from this formulation phase to the implementation phase. And capacity building needs to happen at various scales. So Romy mentioned the importance of these different scales going all the way from global to regional to national to local. Capacity building needs to be part of these scales. Now, I remember very well, many years ago, I used to work for the government of Colombia in South America, coordinating the climate change agenda for the government and formulating policies in relation to climate change. But always the critique was that I was sitting in Bogota, in the middle of Colombia, formulating policies for people that were going to implement them in regions very far away from Bogota, and where the reality was very different from the reality that was lived in Bogota. And that including having the right capacity of local stakeholders to being able to implement these policies. And then my last point, it's in relation to something that Romy mentioned, and it's the opportunity of these long-term strategies. And the way that I see these long-term strategies are that they are the perfect excuse to really think seriously about the future of our countries in Africa. So where do we want to be by 2050? And then by really understanding in a participatory manner with a variety of stakeholders sitting at the table, understanding that vision, that dream, where do we want to be in 2050, then work backwards. Which are the pathways that are going to bring us to that vision by 2050? And so we have the perfect excuse to think about this dream, to think about this vision. And these long-term strategies are important because part of being able to implement these, it's to understand that there are a lot of linkages between agriculture and other sectors in our economies. So what's the relationship between the urban and rural sector? All those things need to be considered in terms of thinking about these pathways for development. So having this food systems approach, where we are considering issues all the way from the production to the consumption of goods, how does agriculture relate with water, with energy, understanding those nexus. Through the developing of these long-term strategies, we have the opportunity to really understand in a comprehensive way and considering this systems approach to being able to get to that vision where we want to be in 2050. So let me stop in there. 4 main points, really interesting. And I would really encourage the team to get all the inputs from this conversation and put it in a 2-pager so that we can make sure that everybody can access these and in a very comprehensive way, easy way, understand main points in order to really start acting upon these analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Maria. That's great. And I really like, how you're emphasizing the importance of understanding local context, about the opportunity of these long-term strategies and looking at South-South collaborations. I think those are really key points. So thank you for that. We'll bring George next, George Wamukoya, the head of AGNES. And I know George has been working with some countries on developing long-term strategies. So George, let's hear your reactions.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and thanks, Romy, for very exciting presentation. At least it covers very important information on policy coherence. Policy coherence. Is it there? The answer is no. If you're looking at the global level, we have challenges, which I think, unless we address them, it's going to continue growing. We have, for example, if I use the Glasgow as a classic example, is that we have the main working streams in the negotiations, but at the same time, we have very many commitments being made outside the negotiation work streams. And all those decisions, the target is countries. At what stage do countries now converge and ensure that that is being implemented? That's a challenge, and I think we need to look at it from that perspective. That at different levels, different strategies and actions and policies are being made, and they don't find space in a systematic way of that would lead to a coherent in the implementation. And that's a reality we have to live with. If you're looking at regional level, and I'm happy, Romy, you pointed out a number of policy instruments that are there, and yet the question would be, how do they feed into the instruments for addressing climate, which is the NDC? And my experience in many countries is that you find the desk of coordinating climate change do not speak to the CADAP desk, and when they are doing their reporting, they don't speak to each other, and as a consequence, you find that there's a disconnect in terms of information being reported about a country and the actual reality of what the country is doing. So again, cross-sectoral coordination and even within the ministry, coordination becomes important. And then there's this, I mean, the concept of CSA, when it first emerged from the meeting we had in The Hague, and that meeting, primarily because I was involved in this planning and facilitation, we wanted to use that as a basis to try and have something outside the UNFCCC on agriculture that would support the negotiations of the work streams. I'm sorry, over the years, we never achieved it. What we achieved finally is GACSA. In our estimation, GACSA did not fill that gap that was required to ensure that we've coherent approach to CSA in this regard. And then finally, with respect to CSA at national level, there are some countries that have actually developed policies and frameworks for CSA. There are others who consider CSA, and because they've been implementing sustainable land and water management, for example, they say their entry point will be in that as opposed to CSA, which is a broader concept. And I think that's the challenge we have in the discussions in the agriculture, in the sense that there are many concepts that are emerging and countries are having difficulties to see how those speak to each other and feed into the existing policy or otherwise improve on the implementation. And so based on that, I think what this paper does is it tries to identify those pathways and proposes some recommendations that need to be taken into consideration in order to bring harmony in that regard. And as colleagues have indicated, the first is, how do we choose the right entry point to ensure that CSA is achieved? And for purposes of implementation of the Paris Agreement, the entry point is the NDC. And so and at national level, we have two processes that are going on. The first one is the development of the long-term strategies, which is looking at the FAR, the 2050, and then you have the NDC, which is a 5-year cycle that is intended to kind of do a milestone every 5 years to see how we're making progress. So CSA must be embedded in all those processes in order to have meaning and also to be in the space of climate change. Secondly is the capacity building, but in that space of science and the policy interface. I think we all agree that policy must be evidence-based, but the extent to which evidence is packaged to feed into the policy is still wanting. Take an example of the IPCC summary for policymakers. It was supposed to be used to be by policymakers to inform policy. But if you read it, even as an expert or a scientist, you find that it's still at a level that many policymakers may not appreciate. And therefore, we need to do more to unpack the best available science so that it's able to inform the policy making. And that's why for CSA, the question will be, what are those menu of practices that countries are using and they're delivering either positive or negative results? I think that will be important. And I recall that CIAT at some stage was compiling a compendium of CSA practices and technologies, and there are over 100 and plus. Now the question is that feasible? I think that is a challenge, and that becomes a problem when you are now looking at the tracking progress on the implementation of CSA activities in relation to adaptation, but more so even on mitigation. Bear in mind that in Africa, you're dealing with very many smallholder farmers. And so the question would, how do you aggregate or what would you do in order to ensure that the cost for tracking progress is important? And this is where I fully agree with Romy that there's this result framework that has been put in place pursuant to Malabo Declaration. It may not be perfect, but at least, for example, they are starting to track resilience, for example. And I think for me that's important. And given that now in Glasgow we have agreed on Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on global goal on adaptation, where one of the objectives is to develop metrics, methodologies. I think we need to build on what we're already doing in Africa under the CADAP to see how it can inform the ongoing discussions on the metrics and the related aspects. And therefore, for me, that will be important. And then finally is the question of case studies. I think we have a problem because when there has been a call from the UNFCCC for countries to share best practices, whether in agriculture or in gender or whatever, countries have been slow in sharing that. We need to understand why. Is it because those case studies in their estimation are not best, and we need to define a criteria as to what is the messaging for that particular case study, because we know that not all case studies may deal with many things. You want to position a case study in a manner to advance a particular position. So in that respect, therefore, I see this study coming at the right time when we're trying to put in place frameworks on how to deliver climate response at a national level through NDCs and LTS, and some of those that are issues that have been identified become critical to help us to address that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Of course, I especially like your point on improving capacity building within the science policy interfaces and helping to package evidence better to help inform policies. So thank you for your remarks. Let's now turn to Caroline Mwongera. Caroline, go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. And first, I want to really commend Romy. I think this is very comprehensive in terms of the issues you're presenting in this paper. So I think it captures really a lot of what we're seeing in terms of what's needed for the policy coherence, especially around CSA. I think I want to summarize my input in terms of how I see what are the key messages or the key areas that for me, I feel there's particular emphasis and attention. And for me, that is around the issue of inclusivity and integration. And if we are looking at Africa, we know majority of our economies, and this is not even very particular to Africa, also could be an example of what also Ana Maria was speaking about Latin America. So we are independent for our GDP and economies. A lot of our dependence is on agriculture. So the key area for me I see is first we should be focusing on CSA in terms of how CSA is linking to national economy. So maybe what Ana Maria was talking about for agriculture being the food systems approach could be one of the ways that we are integrating CSA in terms of addressing our national priorities, as well as how CSA also contributes to our national economies. And I think that framing also helps us to start to see CSA also as contributing not only to addressing the challenges or the contribution of agriculture, but also maybe what we could also be looking at. I know that now in agriculture, we've had this example that we have been looking at the long-term strategies, and even the alliance, we are supporting some countries in terms of developing those LTS. But what we need is to see how CSA also is feeding not just to the agriculture sector, but to the wide economy goals, especially because it's a pillar to national development for most of our African countries. Coming back to that question of inclusivity and integration, which for me is my key area that I want to frame my intervention. One of the aspects that was missing or what we need to emphasize is also that in operationalizing CSA, looking at aspects that you talk about in your initial introductory statements about aspects of inclusivity in terms of for policies, the institutions, and the financing that's required. What is missing here is also that we need to really emphasize that there's a role outside of public or state institutions or state actors. So what's the role of, for instance, non-state actors in the private sector? What's the role of public-private partnerships? And an example I can give is also looking at how we are assessing the achievement of CSA in terms of understanding what are the indicators. And one of the areas we've seen supporting an example in Kenya, where we are supporting Kenya to implement a CSA framework, is that we need to bring also the private sector, the civil society, and those actors, not only at national level, but at sub-national level, lower levels, to be able to also be accountable to the reporting of what we are doing in terms of implementing CSA and what are we achieving from those climate actions that are being implemented at all levels. So that issue of integration, looking at those aspects in terms of the framework of how we integrate both public and private actors is required. And if we look at the existing modalities, I think one example that we looked at in Kenya was the CADIP mechanism. So what we want to see as examples is how do we integrate the way CSA is implemented and reported at UNFCCC at national level based on the national policies and integrate that into the CADIP process. Because those same actors, for instance, you don't want to develop an MABD framework that's is respecting the CADIP process, but then you have to come and have another framework for your UNFCCC reporting. So how do you integrate all those processes in terms of the monitoring and evaluation? How do you look at the indicators, and especially looking at what's available at country level in those country cases in terms of capacity, be it technical, be it the resources available, so that we can be able to measure what we are achieving and be able to track the progress that we are getting. And then lastly, also linked to that issue of integration is, I think, not just about how we bridge the science policy interface, but how do we strengthen that science policy interface? And I know that a lot of work has been around how we create those effective channels and forums by which scientists and policymakers can have dialogues. But what we are missing, and I think what has been a critical gap, and that came out also to be emphasized during the COVID response time, was that we need to look at how science can also be able to be timely in terms of responding to the policy makers' needs. So for instance, how do we have timely preparation of the information, and how is that information being how is it contributing to the advice that is required for the policy responses, and how is that coordinated in the country level? So I think what we need is some formalized mechanisms that science policy processes can be strengthened, and also to identify, especially in the context of Africa, who are some of the experts, and make sure that their integration is sustained. I know AGNES has really tried to play a role in bridging that gap, but we need to have a mechanism that can be able to sustain that engagement, so that the processes of engaging scientists in the policy-making arena can also be processes that are funded well, they are sustained in terms of that engagement, and also we can look at some of the processes that can govern how the engagement is happening. For instance, what the evidence is being brought on board. So I think that's, for me, is my main takeouts of the key areas in the document, and really to emphasize that the need for us to be able to reinforce the collaboration, so that we can be able to look at the multiple objectives of CSA and how it can address our economic priorities for each of the countries that we are looking at in this context. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, those are excellent points. I really like how you emphasize the need for inclusivity and looking at how does CSA feed into the wider economy goals, since agriculture is so important in many of our economies. So thank you for those remarks. I want to ask Romy to come back on our screen. We have several questions in the chat, and thank you all. You can continue putting questions in the chat. We'll read from there, but if you would like to ask a question online, or with using your voice, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So Romy, I want to start with the question that I have seen from Ananaya Chakraborty. So she says, thanks for the insightful presentation. And in your opinion, what are the existing policy level barriers and opportunities in ensuring that CSA leaves no one behind, with a focus on vulnerable communities and gender.
Thank you so much for those. I was sorry, I was not ignoring the chat. I was just focusing on the responses to the presentation. And thank you very much for the responses to my presentation. I was taking lots of notes and will incorporate many of your suggestions. I mean, some of the comments in the chat have actually been answered by some of the presentations. But I'll just pick up on Laura, your question about policy barriers and opportunities to leave no one behind. I think, and Caroline has just spoken obviously to inclusion and integration, which has touched on this as well. The one thing, and this is just coming from my experience in looking at how civil society engages with policymakers, is that I would say only until more recently has there been almost not an urgency and also like a mandate from government to actually consider and include civil society and non-state voices in a very, very serious way. There's been, particularly in the realm of CSA, in the climate change agenda, you can see, again, if I focus on the country level, varying countries have varying track records on inclusion. So there's still a lot of countries through the continent that are not inclusive, that where civil society voices and actors are not included in the policy process. And there are others that have made substantial headway in terms of making sure that voices of marginalized groupings are included in a real way, and not. So a lot of them have been quite superficial, the responses from policymakers to date, where there have been, calls for responses, but those haven't actually been integrated. So if I think about a policy process, for example, like the climate change strategy at the continental level, there was real impetus on making sure that civil society actors were integrated in the formulation of that document. So there was various cycles where there was calls for intervention. There was an extension of an offer to experts to please feed back specific information into specific areas of the strategy. There was numerous validation meetings, et cetera, to ensure that some of those voices were clearly heard. There was review processes that included civil society organizations. So at the policy formulation level and the design of policy, if at that level voices are actually included, where the needs and the interests of civil society organizations are included, then it does start to think, we do start to look at a policy that is not as superficial as some that have previously been. So it's very much about the process of integration, and not only in the design of policy, obviously throughout the whole process of the policy cycle. So what happens at the moment is that governments have said that they cannot on their own implement policies, that they obviously need financial and substantial support from other organizations, including private sector. But the problem is that these entry points for implementation or for monitoring and evaluation are often not as obvious or transparent. So for example, you'll have a policy process that is outlined, a documented framework, and civil society wanting to be involved in the implementation and monitoring of these frameworks, but very little indication of how. So how and where and how, and the finances and the support to make this actually happen. So I think in the whole way that policy is formulated, there has been an absence of voices. That being said, if I look at some of the countries, I know, for example, I've been involved with the South African NDC and now the Just Transition discussions. They're at least making a real attempt at inclusion. So, for example, when they put the NDC together, there was calls for input. They had roadshows where they included various stakeholders at the provincial, local level. They had private meetings with various stakeholders that would lose out, those actors and stranded assets that might lose out for a just transition. And they have actually appointed a commission that engages very, very regularly with different organizations, stakeholder groupings, interest groupings, to try and understand their needs and interests. The other thing is that it's very important is that, for example, in the formulation of an NDC process, is that unless we understand very specifically from civil society what they're needing, it's very difficult to incorporate it into policy. So the onus does not only fall on government. The onus also sits with civil society to ensure that they understand those policy intervention spaces, where there is space to intervene, that civil society in a coherent manner is doing so. And last year, we were actually doing some work with some of the regional farming organizations in exactly this, is policy intervention opportunities in spaces where there's space for real change and opportunities for inclusion. So I think that's a barrier and an opportunity. A barrier is that unless you're involved and understand the policy cycle, process, the actors, unless you have an in, it's going to be very difficult to formulate and change policies. But there are opportunities now, and that on the civil society's side, if we are aware, if we have the right connections, if we understand the processes, there are opportunities for intervention. And this is particularly so for the NDCs, because they have a 5-year revision time process where they have to, there's a mandate to strengthen those NDCs. So by virtue of the fact that they are revising and reviewing, there's an opportunity for consultation with civil society. And then within the formulation of these long-term strategies. And there's been mentioned by a couple of the participants around the real opportunity. So these are transformative economy-wide documents to say, how do we want to see our countries look by 2050? And climate and agriculture and food security, social inclusion are the key processes that we need to, as civil society, influence in these processes. So up to date, there hasn't been massive public consultations around these long-term strategies. The NDCs have been the kind of the short-term time policy documents that are influencing the long-term strategies. But I would just emphasize that those processes will take place, and if they're not taking place, then the civil society needs to request a space at that table. So yeah, it was a very long answer, but hopefully that gives you some food for thought. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Romy. If you don't mind, can we have Anna Maria respond to Celeste's question? Is that all right? Okay, Anna Maria. Oh, and then we'll come to George after that. Okay.
Thank you, Laura. This would be very short because I know that we are running out of time. But I think that was really interesting, the question in relation to the relationship between fragility, instability, and the implementation of climate smart agricultural practices and technologies. And this is something that for the past years, we have been working in the CGR, trying to understand those connections. And the reason for doing this is because we believe that there are a lot of things that are connected, happening at the same time, in relation to building the conditions that are helping countries in order to avoid conflicts, to avoid this lack of instability in their economies. But these factors are related to the way that these countries are responding to climate challenges in terms of building resilience. And the conclusion of these analysis that we have been doing is that we need to really understand those linkages. Because if we are just thinking about security issues, stability issues, without considering what is going to happen to these communities and their vulnerability once that these climate shocks come and affect the rural populations, we're never going to be able to really build this stability in these countries. And the other way around, it works the same way. If we are trying to respond to these climate challenges, extremes, reduction in incomes, but if we don't consider these potential drivers of fragility, of lack of stability, of conflict, then we are never going to be able to respond in a successful way to these climate challenges and to build this resilience that we need to build. So I think that there needs to be a connection, and policy must be aware of that connection. And therefore, things that we do thinking about responses to climate challenges need to consider these drivers in terms of fragility, in terms of conflict. So key message that needs to be part of this somehow recipe to really being able to improve livelihoods of people living under this context and under these situations.
Thanks, Anna Maria. George, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the intervention by Romy as she was responding to the question, and this will apply to all of us who are here. In the calendar of the UNFCCC, this year up to 2024, and particularly next year, we will be looking at what countries are doing in the form of global stocktake. And part of the sources of information for the global stocktake include papers like this one and others. And if we can get some good case studies to show how CSA can help transform the agriculture systems or whatever we call them to that low carbon climate resilient becomes important. And so the point I'm saying is don't wait for a review of the policies, whether at continental or national. There is an opportunity if we can have solid papers, then they'll be looked at under the global stocktake, which kind of a peer review, and that will give them a standing so that they can inform the second generation of NDCs in 2025, and therefore we do have an opportunity on how to do that. But at the same time, I think for those of you who are in this space, the challenge we have is that we are now starting to have conflict of terminologies, and I think from a policy perspective, you cannot have a policy on CSA and then immediately you get other stakeholders coming and saying, okay, we need another policy on agroecology, we need another policy on regenerative agriculture and the rest. Seriously, we need to find a way by which we adopt terminologies or concepts in a manner that are broad enough to accommodate all those different permutations, and that for me is a challenge. And I think Laura, you're aware that in Kenya we have the CSA framework, and then there was a request that we do a policy on agroecology, and the Ministry of Agriculture was saying, okay, can you tell us what is different from CSA and agroecology? And that becomes a problem because each one will try to justify that. So what I'm simply saying is that, now that CSA is crystallizing, it has found its way into the policies. How can we look at the CSA in a broader context that will be able to accommodate any emerging opportunities, so that we don't put our policymakers in a reform mood every day, coming up with new policies? And as you know, policy formulation takes time, and policy implementation to determine whether it's working or not takes time, and politicians are very careful not to take a risk if they're not sure of the outcome of that policy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. Excellent insights there. I want to hand it back to Romy. Romy, take about 5 minutes maybe to address any final questions or comments from the chat, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I just wanted to, I see that Caroline asked me about elaborate on what I meant by multi-stakeholder dialogues that mirror international policy processes. And I actually gave the example of, so obviously last year was the UN Food Systems Summit that took place, and essentially there was, within that framework, there was key principles and a vision outlined for at a global level for food systems broadly, which obviously included some CSA priorities and criteria. And what I meant by mirroring that at a national level is essentially filtering the kind of key messages and visions down to a local process that says, okay, well, what does that mean for at a country or local level? And so we know that preceding that meeting, there was countries in preparation for that meeting had to put together national dialogues on their food system. So transformation from a national perspective. And my idea there is to essentially say we need to continue those discussions to ensure that we are meeting the global priorities that are set out at an international level, essentially translating them into local level action. And as you mentioned, I think was context specific, is essentially saying what does this look like from a country perspective or a local perspective. And when we translate that, is you align with the key kind of recommendations and outcomes of these meetings, whether they be food systems or climate change or other meetings. You align with them and you essentially look at how you can contribute towards meeting that global objective. And we know that there are numerous mechanisms to domesticate these global processes. So we've been speaking a lot about the NDCs, which is an example of the translation of, for the Paris Agreement is our national contribution, how we as countries are going to contribute to the climate change objectives of the Paris Agreement. We know, for example, the same can be said true for the Agenda 2030, the SDG framework. There's national, voluntary national reviews, I think they're called. We essentially, again, we do, from a country perspective, we do a breakdown analysis of what we as countries are doing to contribute to the global agenda, etc., etc. So I hope that answers that question. But there's numerous examples, and yeah, that answers that question. But essentially, I think I can see there's only 5 minutes, but I wanted to just say that again, there's a lot of food for thought. I mean, even taking on this report was quite an extensive feat, in that there's never obviously a space that one can cover everything, but I certainly will, in my policy analysis and my recommendations, is highlight some of the kind of key areas and objectives and recommendations from this meeting. So I do really thank you for your time and your energy, and I'd just like to ask anybody that has specific comments that they feel where my analysis is falling short, or they would like me to emphasize specific things, to please contact me directly. I'm very willing and happy for contributions from a variety of people. So thank you for that. And I guess I'll just hand it back to anyone else. I'm not sure if any of the panelists have any final remarks to make, but again, I thank you for their time. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Romy. Any final remarks from our panelists? I do see that Dr. Wajid has his hand up, but I think we're running out of time, unfortunately. But if you're able to take Romy's email from the chat, and I'm sure she'd even be willing to set up a one-on-one call for you to talk with her and give her your feedback as well. So I think I will just thank everyone for coming. It has been really great. I think the turnout was very good. I'm glad that there was so much interest in this topic. And I hope you'll all download and read the report and email Romy any comments that you may have, and keep following our work through AICCRA and engaging with us. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.